After more than 50 years in prison and 5 recommendations for parole, Leslie Van Houten may actually be released. In the summer of 1969, as part of the Manson family, Leslie Van Houten participated in the murders of Rosemary and Leno LaBianca. We'll talk about the trial for those crimes, subsequent legal proceedings, parole hearings, and how we get to the point where Leslie may actually be released. We'll also delve into Leslie's own story of going from homecoming queen to drug-addled hippie commune dweller, and finally, one of the most notorious murderers in American history, tonight on The Summer of Sam. In 1969, the Tate LaBianca murders gripped the nation. In 1970, Leslie Van Houten and her co-defendants Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel stood trial for those murders, a trial that would become one of the longest-lasting and most expensive trials in American history. The 4 were found guilty and subsequently sentenced to death. The following year, the California Supreme Court outlawed the death penalty, and these 4 inmates' sentences were commuted to life. It's at this point that Leslie's case diverges from the others. Leslie Van Houten was represented by attorney Ronald Hughes during that first trial in 1970. Originally, Hughes had signed on to represent Charles Manson. In fact, he was one of the first attorneys to meet with Manson in December of 1969. Hughes was replaced by Irving Kanarick about 2 weeks before the trial began. Eventually, Hughes would become Leslie Van Houten's attorney. Ronald Hughes had failed the bar 3 times and had never tried a case before this one. On November 27, 1970, Ronald Hughes took a camping trip in a remote area of Ventura County. He was accompanied by 2 friends. During the camping trip, heavy rains had gotten their vehicle stuck in the mud. The 2 friends, James Forsher and Lauren Elder, decided to hitchhike out, while Hughes opted to remain behind. Hughes was last seen by 3 other campers on the morning of November 28th. Those campers told police that Hughes was alone at the time and had briefly stopped to visit with them. When court reconvened on November 30th, Ronald Hughes failed to show up. Due to continued heavy rains, the authorities had to wait a couple of days before they could institute a search. On December 2nd, Judge Older ordered that the trial continue and appointed a new attorney for Leslie Van Houten. On March 29th, 1971, all 4 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to death. On that same day, Ronald Hughes' severely decomposed body was discovered in Ventura County by a couple of fishermen. He was found wedged between 2 boulders in a gorge. At that time, the cause of his death was ruled as undetermined. In 1972, the California Supreme Court outlawed the death penalty, so the 4 defendants had their sentences commuted to life in prison. In 1976, the California Appellate Court ruled that Leslie Van Houten had been denied a fair trial because her attorney Ronald Hughes had disappeared while the trial was in progress. At that time, her sentence and conviction were both overturned. She was retried in 1977, and that resulted in a hung jury. At this point, Leslie Van Houten is released from prison on bond, awaiting a 3rd trial. In 1978, at her 3rd trial, she was found guilty of felony murder and sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. And because of the time served on her original sentence, she was already eligible for parole when she was returned to prison in August of 1978. So since that sentencing, Leslie has been denied parole 19 times. She has been recommended for parole in her 5 last consecutive parole hearings. All 5 of those recommendations were then overturned by the California state governor. Leslie's attorney, Richard Pfeiffer, has appealed the last 2 reversals by the governor. As a result of that, the state appellate court reviewed the governor's denial of her parole board decision from July of 2020, finding that she was suitable for parole. What they've done is vacated the governor's order that parole recommendation be overturned. In other words, in July of 2020, the parole board recommended that Leslie Van Houten be granted parole. The governor reversed that order. Richard Pfeiffer took that to the state appellate court, and they have just decided to vacate the governor's order and allow Leslie to be granted parole. So the way this works is that appellate court decisions become final after 30 days. Then there is an additional 10 days where review can be sought by the California Supreme Court. So that review by the Supreme Court can be initiated by the governor. The governor can request it, or the court of its own volition can undertake that review. So basically, they have 40 days from May 30th to request that the decision be reviewed. And I believe by the end of those 40 days, if a review hasn't been completed, then Leslie would go on and be released, even though the Supreme Court may come back and overturn the decision by the appellate court. But it looks to me like she'll probably be released at least for some period of time, if not actually granted parole. So just to recap, Leslie's original conviction and death sentence were overturned by the court. So in that sense, it's somewhat incorrect to kind of lump her in with the other defendants when you're talking about particularly the legal aspects of this case, because her trial was different, her sentence was different, her legal journey was different than her three co-defendants. So how do we get here? How does Leslie Van Houten go from homecoming queen to drug-addled hippie living in a filthy commune at a dilapidated Hollywood movie ranch, finally to cold-blooded murderer? Well, we can look at some of her autobiographical statements in her various parole hearings over the years to get a bit of an idea. So Leslie came from a sort of typical middle-class family. She reportedly has a high IQ. She was high school homecoming queen for a couple of years. She was the class secretary. As a younger child, she belonged to the Bluebirds. She sang in the Presbyterian church choir. At the age of 14 or 15, her parents divorced. She lived with her mother after the divorce. While in high school, she began using drugs, smoking marijuana, taking LSD. At 17, she becomes pregnant and has an abortion, which she says had a very significant impact on her. In her 1979 parole hearing, she kind of describes all that. And it begins with one of the parole board members addressing her and kind of describing her upbringing. And then he says, in the latter part of high school, you started having some difficulties. Would you like to speak about that? Leslie replies, yeah. I think it was in my junior and senior year, and I'd grown disillusioned with the kind of scene I was in. I was seeing a lot of friends of mine. I thought they were changing with the social status, which I was right in there with. Like you said, I was a winner. I started to go to public dances, and I met Bobby Mackey. I had known him. Well, I had liked him in earlier years, but we started to go together more intensely. And he'd been hanging around with older people that were taking acid. I came home one day, and my brother and his friends were smoking marijuana, and I was curious, and so I tried it. And that was the first time I tried marijuana. And then when I was with Bobby Mackey, he turned me on to acid, and I started to take that. And I just hung around with people from Pasadena instead of Monrovia, my high school. And pretty soon, I just grew further and further away from the high school environment and hung with the older kids that took drugs. Leslie did graduate from high school. After graduating high school, she went to live with her father, and she describes that time period this way. Leslie says, in high school, I had gotten pregnant. I think it was in the beginning of the school year, either October or November, and I had an abortion. After that, Bobby and I decided we would become yogic monks and nuns. We went from the acid into, heavy yogic religion. And so I was waiting. I had to take the lessons for a year before they would allow me to become a renunciate and live on the grounds and all that. So I asked them what they wanted me to do. And they said the best thing to do would be to go, to business college and get secretarial training. And my father jumped at the chance just to get the vocation for me. He wasn't happy about, the renunciate. My mother was very unhappy about that. But that's what got me initiated into the business college. Then halfway through the business college, I quit going to the yogic. I quit being as heavily involved into it as I was. I stopped it and I continued with the business college. So Leslie reportedly excelled at the business college, got her certificate, did very well. She goes on to describe this time period. Towards the end of business college, I started to smoke. Oh, the whole time I was in the self-realization, I didn't take drugs or smoke marijuana. I laid off. So then towards the end of business college, I was smoking weed again, and I had taken some acid, and I went to look for a job in Victorville, where this girl said that we could live at her parents' ranch. My father said I could continue to live under him and look for a job, but I was feeling like I wanted independence. At this point, she's hanging around with some people, and they're offering her a place to live, but there's some problems with it, and it turns out that they really don't have any place to go. So she kind of describes that this way. One of the girls had married a guy that she had run around with in Pasadena. I'll just read the transcript to you. She married a guy that I had run around with in Pasadena in my old LSD kind of group. His name was Duncan, and she needed to go back up to San Francisco. So I drove her up there, and I applied at Kelly Girl, and I, made the application. But within a matter of a week or so, I met Bobby Beausoleil and Catherine Scher, and that's when I dropped out and traveled with them and ended up at Spawn's Ranch. So once she winds up at Spawn Ranch, we kind of know what the situation is from there. And the life at Spawn Ranch has been pretty well documented, and I think everybody's probably pretty familiar with everything that was going on there, so no need to cover that. So when I look back at this, I came of age in the 1980s. So when I come back and look at the 1960s, it looks like complete insanity to me. It looks like an entire generation hell-bent on destroying the foundations of and traditions of society that had allowed that society to function. They seemed intent on destroying that while having absolutely no idea what they were going to replace it with. So it's no wonder that so many of them wound up confused and really in a bad way. I think that many of the social ills that afflict us today had their birth in the 1960s. As far as Leslie's parole is concerned, I don't know that I really have an opinion on it. On one hand, I think murderers should be imprisoned for life, if not given the death penalty. On the other hand, we have a legal system whereby an inmate can earn their release, and by all accounts, Leslie has done what she needed to do to meet that standard for parole. Certainly California has paroled far worse people than her, but it'll be interesting. So sometime in the next 40 days, we'll know if Leslie gets to walk out of prison for the first time in more than 50 years. Hope you enjoyed the episode. So I don't want this to become, a Manson channel, but this is news and important, so I thought we should talk about it. More content to come. We'll talk about other topics, I guarantee you that. We'll talk about other things. We'll talk about soundboard prank phone calls. I've got that in the works. May do an episode on dirty hippies and the destruction they've wrought. We may even talk about some current events. So hope to see you back for the next episode of The Summer of Sam.